Chapter 11 of J.S. Bach by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Newman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Music performed by Jonathan Schofield. The Artist and Teacher. In his criticism of Bach, Schweitzer in one place goes so far as to say that the Herr Hofkompositor is lacking in the general culture that we ought to expect from a great composer. What truth is there in this reproach? As regards culture, Bach was not the inferior of any of the musicians of his epoch. The Latin schools of Ohrdruf and Lüneburg, which he had attended, enjoyed a first-rate reputation, and we know now that he went through the classes from the beginning. That he did not afterwards go to the university was entirely due to the prime necessity of earning his daily bread. He was well versed in Latin, or he would not have been able to offer to give the instruction in this language that it devolved upon him to give in St. Thomas's school. The foreign words in his letters are always used in their correct sense. This shews that he also knew French, which is again clear from the dedication of the Brandenburg concertos, which is very elegantly expressed in that tongue. The addresses of his letters were usually written in French. He signed his name sometimes in German, sometimes in French, and sometimes in Italian. He was conversant with rhetoric as it was then taught, as Birnbaum expressly testifies in the second of his Vindications. The fact, again, that men like Gerstner and Birnbaum found his conversation interesting speaks for his culture. So does the thorough scholarly education that he gave his sons. Unfortunately, Emmanuel and Friedemann have made it impossible for us to know much about the reading of their father, since before the division of the property they placed on one side his collection of old mathematical and musical historical works, which therefore do not figure in the inventory. However, the list of Bach's theological books is alone enough to testify to the activity of his mind. It is interesting to know that he had a translation of Josephus's History of the Jews. We can imagine him after the day's work seeking recreation in the classical work of the favorite and friend of Vespasian. Schweitzer was thus mistaken, and yet, looked at from his own standpoint, a good deal of his reproach is not unfounded, only that he expressed it clumsily. Bach was self-taught, and as such had an aversion to all learned theories. Clavier playing, organ playing, harmony, composition, he had learnt them all by himself. His sole teachers had been untiring work and incessant experiment. To a man who had made the fundamental rules of art his own in this manner, many theories that were interesting or new for others were a matter of indifference, for he had been to the root of things. Now Bach lived in the epoch when it was thought that the perfect art could be discovered by aesthetic reasoning, while others, again, thought that salvation for music lay in mathematical speculations upon the numbers that underlie intervals. To all these endeavors Bach opposed a robust indifference. Our Bach, says the Necrology, did not engage at all in deep theoretical considerations of music, but was all the stronger in the practice of it. Perhaps he let this indifference become too visible. It is certain that it was generally known how little he troubled about the mathematical basis of the fundamental laws of harmony. Not only Mattheson, but Schweitzer testifies to this. Let anyone, says the latter, ask a great Bach who has perfect command of all artifices of art, and whose astounding works one cannot see or hear without surprise, whether in the attainment of this great skill and dexterity he even once thought of the mathematical relations of the tones, and whether he once consulted mathematics in the construction of so many musical artifices. 2/5 and 2 octaves must not follow each other, since that is not only a vitium, but it sounds ill. So ran the third rule of thorough bass that Bach dictated to his pupils. It is not only a vitium, but it sounds ill. We imagine we can see him as he goes up and down listening to the scratching of the quill and laughing merrily to himself. He took so little interest in the activities of the Scientific Musical Society that was constituted at Leipzig under his eyes that at first he had no thought of becoming a member. The fact is all the more striking as Lorenz Christoph Miesler, 1711 to 1778, the founder of the society, had been his pupil for the clavier and composition, and had dedicated to him in 1734, together with three other celebrities, his doctoral dissertation. Quod musica ars sit pars eruditionis philosophicae. Music is a part of a philosophical education. The Societät der musikalischen Wissenschaften was founded by him in 1738. He was of opinion that as a result of its inquiries a new period in music was going to open, and he had a medal struck on which, according to his own description, a naked child flies towards the dawn, on its head a bright star, in its right hand a burning torch inverted, besides which a swallow flies, denoting the dawning of day in music. There was a good deal that was fantastic in the activities of this society. One cannot, however, but respect it when one looks through Miesler's journal, the Musikalische Bibliothek, the organ of the society. It testifies to a solid and learned spirit, and contains plenty of interesting matter. The reader was kept admirably informed upon everything that happened in the sphere of music and of the adjoining sciences. Telemann belonged to the society from 1740. Handel was made an honorary member in 1745. Bach, however, in spite of all the importunities of Miesler, could not decide to apply for admission. He finally did so in 1747, submitting as his specimen composition some canonical variations upon the Christmas hymn, Vom Himmel hoch da komm ich her, and the canon triplex A Sua Voc, which afterwards appeared in the Musikalische Bibliothek. Thereupon he was admitted as 14th member in June 1747. Among other things, the society occupied itself with the question of cantata texts and cherished the design of issuing a pattern cycle. It first contented itself with laying down fundamental principles for the writing of texts of this kind, and published the result of a conference upon this question, according to which the church cantatas should be shorter in winter than in summer, and consist of only 350 bars lasting about 25 minutes. In the good season, 8 to 10 minutes could be added, and the music could extend to 400 bars. The normal cantata should be laid out as follows: 1. Chorale chorus or chorus upon a short passage from the Bible. 2. Recitative of 12 or 20 lines in length. 3. An aria arioso or a fugued chorale. 4. Recitative. 5. Aria. 6. Chorale or fugue. A warning is given against too ardent and too emphatic poetry, since there is a risk, if violent passions are expressed in church, of making a ridiculous effect. The librettist must not only have the gift of writing ably and edifyingly, but must also have some understanding of music. The da capo form is admitted for the arias; for the recitative, rhymes are desirable. Bach does not seem to have participated in these deliberations, for the cantata type that was put forward as the norm is quite different from his. The warning, indeed, that nothing passionate should be expressed in church seems rather to be directed against him than to emanate from him. Posterity owes a debt of gratitude to the Miesler Society. In its journal for 1754 it gave a necrology of Bach that contains the earliest biographical material relating to him. Or should we rather say that the Society is indebted to Bach? For but for him, who would remember this old association today? The self-taught Bach thus belonged to no school. No preconceived opinions guided him in his studies. His authorities were all acknowledged masters, the old as well as the new. As often as the distances, his means and his leisure permitted, he went to hear contemporary celebrities and to learn what he could by observation of them. He copied out the works of others. In conformity with the old tradition of the Bachs, he did not extend his journeys beyond the German frontier. None the less was he thoroughly acquainted with Italian and French art. Among the French, Couperin chiefly attracted him. In Weimar he occupied himself especially with the Italians. Frescobaldi, 1583 to 1644, Legrenzi, Lotti's teacher, 1625 to 1690, Vivaldi, died 1743, Albinoni, 1674 to 1745, and Corelli, 1653 to 1713. Of the German clavicinists he had a particular regard for Froberger. According to Forkel, he studied the contemporary French organ composers with the greatest assiduity. We have evidence of Bach's occupation with other masters in his transcriptions of their works: 16 clavier concertos, 4 organ concertos, and a violin concerto arranged for 4 claviers. Misled by the inexact headings of the copies of these arrangements, musicians at one time thought they were all works by Vivaldi, whose violin concertos at the time Bach was in Weimar astonished the whole musical world by the novelty of their style. Vivaldi was especially well known in Germany from his having been Concertmeister at the Darmstadt court until 1713. Later research, assisted by the discovery of the originals of the Vivaldi concertos, has shown that not all these transcriptions are based on works by Vivaldi. From him are derived the clavier concertos No. 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, and 14, the organ concertos No. 2 and 3, and the concerto for 4 claviers, clavier concerto No. 3, is an arrangement of an oboe concerto of the Venetian Benedetto Marcello, 1686 to 1739. No. 14 is founded on a violin concerto by Telemann. Numbers 11 and 16 are derived from violin concertos of Duke Johann Ernst of Weimar, who was a pupil of Walter and a friend of Bach. This young prince, a nephew of the reigning duke, died at Frankfurt on the Main in 1715, barely 19 years old, after long and severe suffering. Bach's transcriptions are like a greeting sent into eternity to the friend who had been torn from him. Johann Ernst's concertos were until recently regarded as lost. It was only known that Telemann had edited 6 of them, and that Mattheson, in his great General Bass School, had spoken of them in the terms of high praise. To find such independent princes, he there says, who compose music that can be performed, is indeed something that does not happen every day. In 1903, the Telemann edition was found by the active Bach investigator Schering in the Grand Ducal Library. It has a preface in French by the editor that bears the date of 1st February 1718. A second collection was to have followed, but it never appeared. The clavier concerto No. 13, the first movement of which reappears in the first organ concerto, is also probably founded on a work by the young prince, as is shown by some remarks on the manuscript copy that we possess. The original, however, has not yet been discovered. The original of the clavier concertos No. 6, 8, 10, 12, and 15, and the organ concerto No. 4 are as yet unknown. They may come to light when the treasures of the old chamber music become better known. When this happens, it is possible that this or that original work of Bach will prove to be a transcription. Spitta believed the 3 clavier sonatas to be especially characteristic of Bach's style, and even arranged them chronologically, placing the one in C major among the works of the composer's maturity. Afterwards he had to recognize them as the work of Johann Adam Reinken, whom one was not exactly accustomed to regard as a striking composer. They were originally suites for 3-stringed instruments, published in the Hortus Musicus of the Hamburg composer. What was Bach's object in making these transcriptions? It was formerly thought that he did this work simply for his own instruction. That may be so to some degree in the case of Vivaldi. The Prince of Weimar, however, was not an acknowledged master. Then did Bach wish to make these chamber music works more generally known by arranging them for a single instrument? This was not the reason, for he did not concern himself in the least to transcribe them as they were in the original, but treated them all alike with the utmost freedom, no matter who the composer might be. Where he thinks the basses inexpressive, he substitutes others for them. He adds new or interesting middle parts almost throughout. He even transforms the upper voice completely when it occurs to him to do so. Not even the plan and the development of the works are respected. Sometimes he goes his own way immediately after the first bars, then follows the original for a little while, again branches off, returns once more, omits something here, inserts something there, without troubling himself whether his transcription becomes only half or twice as long as the originals. He does not learn from the originals, but with masterly corrections rather sits in judgment on them, though this was certainly not his intention. It is really quite inconceivable that Bach, now in the epoch of his first mastery, with a copious fund of themes and motives, should need to learn upon the ideas, often commonplace, of others. That his Weimar friend Johann Gottfried Walther should have delighted in making transcriptions and cultivated the practice assiduously is not astonishing. His was not at all a creative mind. But that Bach, whose inventive power is simply beyond comprehension, should have indulged in the practice is merely part of the fact, incapable of psychological explanation, that whenever he could he went to external stimuli with examples for his own creations. This was the case not only in his youthful period, but also in his latest creative epoch. He liked other people's music in the most uncritical way, simply because it stimulated his own creative activity. In certain cases, it was an actual necessity to him. His contemporary Magister Pitschel of Leipzig tells us that before improvising he generally played from the score a work by some other man, as if he first has to set the machine of his invention going by artificial means. This fact was a matter of common knowledge. You know, writes Magister Pitschel to his friend, that the famous man who in our town enjoys the greatest reputation for music and the admiration of all connoisseurs cannot, they say, ravish people with his own combinations of tones until he has played something from a score to set his imagination in motion. Forkel also tells us something of this suggestive action of other men's music on Bach. He says that if a single bass part, often badly figured, were set before him, he would amuse himself by immediately playing a complete trio or quartet from it. If he were in a gay humour and fully conscious of his power, he would instantly extemporize to 3 obbligato voices a fourth of his own, thus turning a trio into a quartet. So that Bach transcribed the Vivaldi and other concertos not to make them more accessible to the public at large, not to learn from them, but simply because this was his way and it gave him pleasure. Nevertheless, it is certain that he derived some profit from Vivaldi. He learned from him charity and design in the structure of a work. Through the Italian he won freedom from the northern masters and their ingenious intricate style. There is preparing that great synthesis of the North German art of ideas and the Latin art form that traverses Bach's work in the most varied phases, till finally, in the organ works of the later period, the art of Buxtehude and Pachelbel again emerges, purified, transfigured, and more profound, and close the circle. Bach further learned from Vivaldi the perfect violin technique, the art of writing singably. The violin art of the North, which he had hitherto known, was in many respects more brilliant and splendid. But it had not the same knowledge of how to utilize the natural advantages of the instrument. It is interesting to observe that Bach transfers violin music to the clavier and the organ, and tries to get the effect of the strings on the keyed instruments. It shows what we can also gather from his works, that for him there was really only one style, that naturally suggested by the phrasing of the stringed instrument, and that all other styles are for him only modifications of this basic style. At other times Bach borrows from his original only the theme, which he then works out quite independently. We know that the theme of the C minor organ fugue Peters IV, 6 is derived from Legrenzi, 1625 to 1690, and that of the small one in B minor, Peters IV, 8, from Corelli, 1653 to 1713. Albinoni, 1674 to 1745, gave him the themes for 2 clavier fugues. We cannot say, of course, how many themes of his own owe their origin to the effect of other men's ideas. There are certainly more of these, however, than we should at first imagine. Who would think that the consummate theme of the great G minor organ fugue was generated in Bach's imagination by another musician? We know, however, not that Reinken's Hortus Musicus has been made accessible, that it was he who set Bach's invention on that path. The theme in question is found in the 5th suite. Thus many a great idea, that in other men merely existed obscurely in an insignificant form, had to come to Bach to be endowed with a life that really belonged to it. In Leipzig, where he was mainly occupied with vocal compositions, he concerned himself more with the masters of Italian vocal music, Palestrina, 1515 to 1594, Lotti, 1667 to 1740, and Caldara, 1670 to 1736. To the end of his days, he was, like all the great self-taught men, very receptive, and sure that he could always learn something from others. He showed the liveliest interest in everything that appeared in his own sphere. Kant was not more anxious to learn what was going on in European literature than Bach was to get hold of the works of contemporary composers. He had also the open mind of the self-taught men for inventions. He was not interested in scientific and aesthetic theories upon music, whatever related to practice, however seemed to him, even if it were concerned with the smallest detail, important enough to be worthy of his serious attention. He was particularly interested in instrument making. As one of the leading experts of his epoch, he witnessed a transition from the old to the modern instruments, though he saw only the beginnings of the new era and still clung to the old with some tenacity. What he thought upon the progress of organ and clavier making we know from his pupil Agricola, who in 1759 succeeded Graun as leader of the Royal Kapelle in Berlin. Lorenz Albrecht showed him the manuscript of the Musica Mechanica Orgonedi of Jakob Adlung, with the publication of which he had been entrusted after the death of the author, and asked him to indicate in the notes Bach's views upon clavier and organ building so far as they differed from what was said there, which Agricola did. Where Agricola is silent, we may assume that Adlung's opinions are in agreement with those of Bach. We also know from Forkel that Bach gave his special attention to the improvement of the organ wind chest and bellows. The first thing he did in examining an organ was to draw all the sounding stops and then play the instrument, getting as much tone as was possible out of it. He used to say in jest that he must first of all know whether the instrument had good lungs. He liked good reed work, and an organ could hardly have too much of it to please him. He did not object, for example, to the 16 reeds on the organ of St. Catherine's Church in Hamburg. Reinken, who voiced it himself, also thought its disposition excellent. On the same organ, Bach was surprised by the clear and precise speaking of a 32 feet principal and the 16 feet pedal trombone. In order to move easily and surely from one manual to another, Bach liked them to be as close together as possible. The keys were to be short and narrow, so as to be spanned with ease. He liked the semitone keys, which were white on the old organs, to be narrow at the top and well rounded. He also appears, so we gather from Agricola, to have favored the old narrow pedals, and to have insisted that the pedal board should lie in a correct and natural position with regard to the manuals. In general, it may be said that organ building in Bach's time had attained to a beauty and richness of tone, particularly through the technical improvements of Andreas Silbermann of Strasbourg, 1678 to 1734, and Gottfried Silbermann of Freiburg, 1683 to 1753, which have not been surpassed since. A certain finality had been reached in this department. It was not so, however, in the sphere of clavier manufacture. Here 3 instruments, 2 old and 1 new, struggled with each other for predominance. The oldest was the clavichord, in which the strings were set in vibration by a rather primitive piece of mechanism, a tangent striking them from below. Nevertheless, at the beginning of the 18th century, some important improvements had been made in this instrument. Its advantage consisted in the fact that it permitted dynamic nuances, since the strength of the tone, as on our modern pianoforte, could be regulated by the touch. It had, however, the great disadvantage of not producing a very loud tone. In the clavicembalo, also called clavecin, cembalo, or in general flugel, the tone was made by the strings being plucked, or, as Adlung expresses it, flipped by a quill or metal pin. It had a clear and penetrating tone, which, however, soon ceased. Nuances and a singing style were therefore both impossible upon it. In order to get at least 2 degrees of tone, in Bach's time, clavicembali were built with 2 keyboards, one manual being for forte, the other for piano. Further improvements were a pedal board also provided with strings and a manual coupler, by means of which the lower manual could be made to sound simultaneously a higher octave. It was for clavicembali of this kind that the Goldberg variations, the Italian concerto, and the so-called organ sonatas of Bach were written. Speaking generally, all organ works could be played on these instruments. This explains why Bach published a collection of long chorale preludes as the 3rd part of the Klavierübung. There also sprang up at this time the Hammerklavier, piano e forte, which was designed to combine the advantages of the clavichord and those of the clavicembalo, and to supplant them both. Our modern pianoforte is derived from it. The self-releasing hammer, by which the hammer clavier first became possible, was invented about the same time in Italy by the Florentine instrument maker Cristofori, before 1911, and in Germany by Gottlieb Schroeter, organist at the Hauptkirche in Nordhausen, 1717. Gottfried Silbermann, the Freiburg organ builder, tried to improve upon the invention and to interest his friend Bach in it. The master's attitude towards the new instrument may be given in the words of Agricola, who is our sole testimony in the matter. Herr Gottfried Silbermann, he says in a long note to Adlung's Musica Mechanica, had at first made two of these instruments. The late Kapellmeister Johann Sebastian Bach had seen and played upon one of these. He had praised the tone of it, indeed wondered at it, but had objected that it was too weak in the upper part, and that it was much too hard to play. Herr Silbermann, who could not endure to have his work blamed, took this very ill. For a long time he was angry with Herr Bach for it. Nevertheless, his conscience told him that Herr Bach was not altogether wrong. So he thought it best to take his great credit, be it said, not to make any more instruments like these, but to try all the harder to correct the defects that Herr Johann Sebastian Bach had pointed out. He worked at this for many years, and that this was the true reason for this delay I doubt so much less, as I have heard it candidly confessed by Herr Silbermann himself. At last, when Herr Silbermann had really hit upon many improvements, especially with regard to the action, he again sold one to the Prince of Rudolstadt. Shortly afterwards the King of Prussia ordered one of these instruments, and, as he was greatly pleased with it, he ordered several more of Herr Silbermann. In all these instruments, those who, like myself, had seen one of the two earlier ones, were especially able to see how industriously Herr Silbermann must have worked at improving them. Herr Silbermann had also had the praiseworthy ambition to show one of these new instruments to the late Herr Kapellmeister Bach, and to get him to try it, and he was warmly praised for it. These were Silbermann fortepianos, on which Bach, according to Forkel, had to play before Frederick the Great at Potsdam. The king had acquired 15 of them. They now lie all about useless in various corners of the royal castle, says Forkel in his biography of Bach, 1802. This passage came into the mind of Robert Eitner, the able musical historian, when he was delayed in Potsdam by the rain one afternoon in 1873. He went into the castle and found one of the Silbermann instruments in Frederick the Great's room. We thus still possess one of the claviers upon which old Bach played to old Fritz. At that time, however, he could not have found very much pleasure in the new instrument. At any rate, he did not trouble to acquire one for himself. 5 clavicembali are specified in the list of the property left at his death, among them the 3 with pedals which he had presented to his youngest son. He thus clung to the older, in fact to the very oldest instrument, the clavichord. This was his favourite. The clavicembalo was too soulless for him, although he appreciated and knew how to turn to account the effect to be had by changing from one keyboard to the other. He played it in public. For himself, for private musical entertainment and for practice, as Forkel says, he used only the clavichord. He found it most apt for the expression of his finest thoughts, and did not believe that such variety of nuance in the tone could be got on any flugel or pianoforte as on this instrument, that was indeed poor in tone, but extraordinarily flexible in detail. Mattheson also preferred the clavichord to the clavicembalo, on account of its delicacy, as Adlung expresses it. The latter is also of opinion that Manieren, embellishments, cannot be expressed on any other instrument so well as on the clavichord, and that none sings so sweetly and so long. In that epoch every artist was still to some extent an instrument maker, and every instrument maker to some extent an artist. It was at least expected of every capable player that he should be able to keep his instrument in repair, including the tuning, and in the case of the clavicembalo, the renewing of defective quills. Bach was expert in both of these. No one, says Forkel, could ever quill his flugel to his satisfaction. He always did it himself. He also tuned both his flugel and his clavichord, and was so expert at this work that it never took him more than a quarter of an hour. He was indeed not so expert as Adlung, who built claviers in his leisure hours until he lost all his costly woods in a fire. He invented, however, a lute clavier, which he got the organ builder Zacharias Hildebrand to make for him. Agricola gives a description of the instrument, which he himself had seen in Adlung's work. What Bach meant to do with this clavier is not quite clear. It could only be of use for playing his lute compositions on a keyed instrument. The invention of the viola pomposa, on the other hand, which Bach had built by the Leipzig court instrument maker Hoffmann, had some practical value. It had 5 strings tuned C sharp, G, D, A, E flat, thus occupying a middle place between the violas and the cellos. It was held like a violin. Bach had the difficult and hastily figured basses in the accompaniments of the arias played on it. Our information as to this instrument comes from Ernst Ludwig Gerber (1746 to 1819), who served under 3 ruling princes of Schwarzburg-Sondershausen as jurist and court organist, and occupied his spare time with the compilation of a historical biographical dictionary of musicians that was intended to complete Walther's work. His father, who was also jurist and court organist to the princes of Schwarzburg-Sondershausen, had been Bach's pupil in Leipzig from 1724 to 1727, and had then heard the viola pomposa used as a substitute for the violoncello. How greatly Bach was pleased with this instrument may be guessed from the fact that to the 5 sonatas for violoncello he added another for viola pomposa. When he had this instrument constructed, whether earlier in Cothen or later in Leipzig, we cannot now be sure. He also planned a pedal glockenspiel that was to have been added to the organ at St. Blasius's church in Mulhausen. Whether this happened is doubtful, as Bach left that town before the completion of the organ repairs which he was superintending. In later times he set no value on trivialities of this kind in organs. It was during his lifetime, again, that the oboe d'amore was invented, and the flute traversière, which supplanted the old flute à bec, was improved. The story that at Cothen he amused himself with inventing a musical clock is due to the imagination of one of his biographers. An innovation that Bach introduced in fingering was of permanent value. On the organ as well as on the clavier he desired an absolute and delicate legato style. Such a method of playing, however, was impossible without a reform of technique. At that time every one placed his fingers just as it occurred to him to do. The thumb was not used at all, or only in cases of necessity. My late father, says Emmanuel, in his Versuch über die wahre Art das Klavier zu spielen, told me that in his youth he had heard great men who never used the thumb except when it was necessary to make big stretches. As he lived in an epoch in which there came about gradually a more remarkable change in musical taste, he found it necessary to think out for himself a much more thorough use of the fingers, and especially of the thumb, which, besides performing other good services, is quite indispensable in the difficult keys where it must be used as nature intends. About the same time as Bach, François Couperin (1668 to 1733) in Paris hit upon the new fingering, and published it in his book L'Art de toucher le clavecin (1717). As Bach was deeply interested in Couperin's work, it was thought that he had got his fingering from him, against which theory, however, Emmanuel rightly protested to Forkel. He points out how much more radical the reform of his father proved than that of Couperin. We must be careful, however, not to identify Bach's fingering with that of modern times. It was richer than ours, since it represents the transition from an old method to a new one, just as the richness of his harmonies is due to the fact that he writes in major and minor and yet keeps within the sphere of the old modes. Thus of the old fingering he retained the simple passing of one finger over another, while adopting the new method of employing the thumb. In time this free passing of one finger over another fell more and more into disuse, and fingering came to be based simply on the combinations made possible by the passing under of the thumb. Emmanuel occupies a middle position between his father and the modern method. He still retains in principle the crossing of the fingers, but discards the passing of the second over the third finger, the third over the second, and the fourth over the fifth. he regards the passing of the thumb under the fifth finger as an abomination. On the whole, he cannot do much with the little finger, so that Bach evidently did not use this much. Every player of Bach's works, unless he wishes to lose himself in complicated substitutions, has frequently to pass one finger over another, especially the third over the fourth and the fourth over the fifth, so that Bach's music itself instructs us as to his fingering, and indeed compels us in some measure to adopt it. Strongly incurved and loose fingers and loose wrists were also part of Bach's method of playing. The fingers rested directly on the keys. He himself played with so slight and easy a motion of the fingers that one could hardly notice it. Only the front joints of the fingers were in motion. The hands preserved its rounded form even in the most difficult passages. The fingers were only slightly raised above the keys. His touch was very complex. He aimed chiefly at a singing tone. To this end, he did not merely let the key, after pressing it down, come to rest and then ascend, but raised it by a gradual drawing back of the fingertips towards the inner flat of the hand, so as to give the string the proper time to vibrate and die away. By this means the tone was not only prolonged, but also made more beautiful, so that even on an instrument so poor in tone as the clavichord, he could play cantabile and legato. This style of playing applies, of course, only to the clavichord, where finger and string stood in intimate relation to each other, and not to the clavicembalo. Bach's touch was therefore absolutely modern, for the latest theories upon the singing tone of the pianoforte agree in recognizing it to depend not only on the striking of the keys, but also to a great extent on the regulation of their ascent. Bach is also modern in this respect, that he would have spoken not of a touch, but only of a conscious transmission of strength and pressure to the keys. Sebastian Erard's invention of the double escapement, 1823, which made possible endlessly varied gradations in the restriking of a tone, would thus have been joyfully welcomed by Bach. The mechanism of the modern pianoforte is in fact mostly only the fulfillment of his boldest dreams. He would not have altogether agreed with the size of our keys and with the strength of pressure that they demand. We have no definite information as to his organ pedalling. We may suppose that he did not use the heel much, the shortness of the pedals in those days not allowing this. On the other hand, he would take advantage of the narrowness of the pedals of that time, which he himself favored, to glide from one to the other with the toes. What astonished his hearers, besides the plasticity and clearness of his playing, was his calmness during performance. Scheiber and Forkel refer to this as to something quite exceptional. Our pianists, and more especially our organists, would do well to take him as their model in this respect. Of Bach as a violin player we unfortunately know little. This much is certain, that he had thoroughly studied the technique of the instrument, or he would not have written the sonatas for solo violin in the way he did. The ties that he indicates for the strings in his scores also reveal the master. We do not exactly know how the violin was played in Bach's time. It seems to be more and more certain that at that time the hairs of the violin bow were fastened without screws to the wood, and were stretched by the thumb of the right hand tighter or looser as one wanted. Springing bowing was thus out of the question, whereas double stopping was made possible to an extent which we today, with our bows stretched as they are, cannot form any idea. The chord sequences of the chaconne, which we laboriously accomplish now by throwing the bow back on the lower strings, presented no difficulties in those days, when the player relaxed the bow for a moment so that it could curve over the strings. We can hardly imagine now the special tone effects made possible by this technique. For echo effects the player suddenly loosened the hairs, thus obtaining a murmuring ethereal tone. In chamber music Bach played for preference the viola. With this instrument he was, as it were, in the centre of the harmony, where he could hear and enjoy to the utmost what was going on both sides of him. His mastery in improvisation was well known. He was often begged by friends to perform on the organ, and he generally complied with willingness. He probably preferred the organ of the University Church for these performances, since it answered better to his wishes than that of St. Thomas's, although even it did not wholly satisfy him. He himself always regretted not to have had a really large and really fine organ at hand for his regular use. If he improvised for as long as 2 hours together, the theme remained the same from the beginning to the end. First of all he made a prelude and a fugue out of it on the full organ. Then he showed his skill in registration in a trio or a four-part movement. Then, as a rule, came a chorale prelude. Finally, he developed a new fugue upon the old theme. So at least we are told by Forkel, who also says that, according to Emmanuel, the organ compositions that we have given no adequate idea of the magnificence of Bach's improvisation on the organ. Organ builders and organists were appalled when they saw him registering. They thought that such a combination of stops could not possibly sound well together, but wondered greatly when they perceived that the organ now sounded at its best, the effect merely being a slightly strange and unusual one, which could not be achieved by their own style of registration. This refers, however, only to the style of Bach's preliminary organ registration for his prelude or fugue, not to a constant change of registration during the performance, after the manner that is today thought best for his organ works. Bach was as ignorant of this practice as of modern orchestration. It gave him particular pleasure, when improvising, to go into all possible keys, and to move about even in the most distant ones in such a way that his hearers did not observe it, but thought he had only modulated within the inner circle of a single key. In conducting, says the Necrology, he was very accurate and extremely sure in the tempo, which he generally took very briskly. Forkel also lays stress on his lively tempi. This, however, is to be understood relatively, with reference to the fact of taking tempi in those days. It seems strange, at first sight, that Bach, when improvising, should have confined himself to a single theme. One would have expected that this richly inventive genius would have been so overwhelmed by the weight of the ideas that thronged within him that he could not have kept to one theme alone, but would necessarily have given voice to them all. It was not so. Everything points to the fact that Bach did not invent easily, but slowly and with difficulty. We must not be misled by the fact that we possess hardly any sketches or drafts of his, and that the scores of his cantatas give the impression of having been thrown off in one breath, so quickly, in fact, that the flying pen could scarcely keep pace with the ideas. The working out and elaboration of the themes may indeed not have cost him very much time, since it often happens with him that the whole piece, with all its developments, is already implicit in the theme, and evolves out of it with a certain aesthetic mathematical necessity, quite irrespective of the formal element in the development of a chorale chorus, a fugue, or a da capo aria. We can, however, form only a faint idea of the long and arduous mental work that is presupposed in the development of a characteristic theme of this kind, according to its own mysterious inner laws, into a masterly piece of music. If Bach, as is generally supposed, had shaken themes out of his sleeve after the manner of genius, it would be incomprehensible how they all come to be so extraordinarily rich and characteristic. In all his works, there is not one that is banal. But neither do we get the impression in any one of these melodies, quivering as they are with inner life, of effortless invention, and the deeper we penetrate into Bach, the stronger does this feeling become. Bach thus worked like a mathematician, who sees the whole of a problem at once, and has only to realize it in definite values. His way of working, as Spitta says, was consequently quite different from that of Beethoven. The latter experimented with his thoughts. In each case, the explanation must be sought in the nature of the music itself. With Beethoven, the work is developed by means of episodes that are independent of the theme. These do not occur in Bach. With him, everything that happens is simply an emanation from the theme. It was characteristic of this method of creation that he generally wrote in quick succession a string of works of the same kind, as if he wanted to pursue to its conclusion, in all its possible manifestations, some image that was floating before his eyes, and as if he had to exhaust the taste of this before he could pass on to something else. Those works of his that have an inner relationship to each other almost always originated about the same time. He seldom took up a work a second time without fundamentally transforming it. To make a copy of anything was to improve upon it. Yet these corrections, however radical they might be, were as a rule only in the details, the plan of the piece being affected by them only in exceptional cases. Among the more thoroughgoing revisions may be mentioned that of St. John Passion. Towards the end of his life he appears to have intended a revision of all his instrumental works. Death overtook him while he was revising the chorale preludes. In Bach's documents we see the same mathematical habit of mind that we find in his compositions. be it a petition to the electoral prince, or an estimate for the renovation of an organ, or a memorial to the council, we are always struck by the same logical clearness and plasticity. Not a word too many, not a word too few. It is an aesthetic pleasure to read them. But wherever he wants to express something emotional, speech fails him completely. The passages in the text which we are probably justified in attributing to him are so confused and awkward, so nonsensical, in fact, that we ask ourselves how he could pen such things, to say nothing of the Saxon dialect which he uses in his verses. We must remember, however, that this curious change almost invariably occurs whenever the mathematical mind branches out into the domain of imaginative thought, whether in poetry or philosophical speculation. Perhaps we can still better characterize Bach's mind as architectonic. The powerful aesthetic impression given by his works comes from the harmony of the whole structure, in which all the copious and animated details fit quite naturally. Bach's music is the perfected Gothic of the art. The further he advances in his fugues, the simpler and grander become the lines. The great organ fugue in G minor is almost the most perfect in this respect. It is extremely rich in the most striking and most interesting evolutions of detail, but not one of them diverts the interest to itself. The only purpose of them all seems to be to throw into relief the fundamental simplicity, vitality, and lucidity of the structure. In Bach's music, much more than in that of any other composer, the plastic outline of the whole is the result of the optical effect of the details. It requires, in order to become visible, a synthetic activity of the hearer's aesthetic imagination. Even to the best musician, at a first hearing, a Bach fugue seems chaos, while even to the ordinary musician this chaos becomes clear after repeated hearings when the great lucid lines come out. An anecdote that has survived shows that in practical architecture also Bach was gifted with unusual insight. When he was in Berlin, says Forkel, he was shown the new opera house. At the first glance he detected everything that was excellent or faulty in the non-musical portions of the building, which others had discovered only by experience. He was taken into the great dining room. He went into the gallery that runs round it, looked at the ceiling, and said, with much ado, that the architect had here accomplished, perhaps unconsciously, and without anyone else being aware of it, a piece of jugglery. That is to say, when someone spoke quite softly against the wall in one corner of the gallery of the oblong room, anyone who stood above the arch in the other corner, with his face turned to the wall, could hear the words quite distinctly, though they were not audible to anyone else in the whole room, either in the middle or at any other spot. This effect came from the form and position of the arches fixed to the ceiling, the peculiar quality of which he detected at the first glance. A man with this open and lucid understanding of everything that concerned his art must have been a good teacher. That he did not achieve anything with the pupils at St. Thomas's was due to special external circumstances and difficulties, and to his own ability to preserve discipline. The member of the council who declared at the sitting after his death that Herr Bach was certainly a great musician, but no schoolmaster, was quite right. Kant, looking back upon his own years as a private tutor, said of himself that there had never been a worse teacher with better intentions. Of Bach it could be said that no one had ever been a worse schoolmaster with greater talent for teaching. But to those who were willing to learn from him, he was an excellent guide. We know the names of some of his pupils. In Weimar and Cothen there were Johann Martin Schubart, who succeeded him in the organist post at Weimar in 1717, Johann Caspar Vogler, who in 1735 won a brilliant victory over 10 other candidates at an examination performance in the Marktkirche at Hanover, Johann Tobias Krebs, organist at Buchstädt, who left Walter in order to study with Bach, Johann Caspar Ziegler, later at St. Ulrich's Church in Halle, Bernhard Bach, his nephew from Ohrdruf, who afterwards succeeded his father, and to whom we are indebted for many valuable copies of Bach's organ works. Among those of the Leipzig period may be mentioned Johann Nikolaus Gerber, afterwards organist and jurist at Sondershausen, Samuel Anton Bach, the son of Ludwig Bach of Meiningen, afterwards court organist there, Johann Ernst Bach, the son of Johann Bernhard of Eisenach, Johann Elias Bach, cantor at Schweinfurt, who, though well on in years, came to study with his relative in 1739, Johann Ludwig Krebs, the son of the former Weimar pupil, who studied with Bach from 1726 to 1737, first as a foundation scholar at St. Thomas's, then as a student, and whom the master thought most highly of after his two sons. He was afterwards organist at Zwickau, then at Zeitz, and finally at Altenburg, where he died in 1780. Johann Schneider, organist at St. Nicholas's in Leipzig, Bach's faithful assistant. Georg Friedrich Einecke, afterwards cantor at Frankenhausen. Johann Friedrich Agricola, related on his mother's side to Handel, who in 1741 became organist at Berlin, and royal Kapellmeister after Graun's death in 1759. Johann Friedrich Dolus, Bach's second successor in the cantorate. Gottfried August Homilius, afterwards cantor at the Kreuzschule at Dresden. Johann Philipp Kernberger, whom Gerber thought to Bach, who became court musician to the Princess Amalia of Prussia and died in 1783. Rudolf Strauber, who afterwards went to England. Christoph Transchel, afterwards an esteemed teacher of the pianoforte in Dresden, died 1800. Johann Theophilus Goldberg, the clavecinist of Court Kaiserling, for whom Bach wrote the celebrated variations. Johann Christoph Altnikol, who in 1749 became Bach's son-in-law. Johann Christian Kittel, who was 18 years of age at Bach's death, and who, as organist at Erfurt, carried on the Bach tradition into the 19th century. He died in 1809. Johann Gottfried Mutel, afterwards organist at Riga, who came to Bach when the latter was already in his last illness. The chapter on Bach's work as a teacher is one of the most interesting in Forkel's book. Emanuel and Friedemann must have given him copious information on the subject. The first thing Bach did was to teach his pupils his own special style of touch. To this end, for several months they had to practice nothing but separate exercises for all the fingers of both hands, with constant regard to his clear and neat touch. These exercises were prescribed to everyone for several months. Bach's conviction was that they should be continued for at least 6 to 12 months. If it happened, however, that anyone's patience was becoming exhausted after a few months, he was pleased to write little connected pieces in which these exercises were embodied. This was the origin of the little preludes for beginners and of the inventions which Bach, according to Forkel, composed during the hours of instruction. When the pupils had acquired the sense of touch, he gave them moderately difficult exercises. This is clear from the arrangement of Friedemann's Klavierbuchlein, in which, according to our ideas, the difficulties increase rather rapidly. He familiarized them from the beginning with the Manieren, that is, the embellishments. In Friedemann's Klavierbuchlein, they are all noted and explained on the first page, so that we would almost believe that the teacher had used them for the first finger exercises. This authentic information as to how Bach himself performed the embellishments is of the utmost practical significance for us. Preludizing on the part of the teacher played a great part in Bach's method of instruction. Gerber, who was his pupil from 1724 to 1727, had the first part of the well-tempered clavichord played for him by his master no less than 3 times, and reckoned those the happiest hours of his life when Bach, under the pretext of being unable to find any pleasure in informing, sat down at one of his excellent instruments and transformed the hours into minutes. After the pupils had made some progress in the technique of the instrument, the lessons in composition began. A musical education devoted merely to the technique of performance, such as is mostly the rule nowadays, unfortunately was not usual then, and least of all with Bach. The pieces that he made his pupils play served at the same time as examples in composition as the title pages of the Inventions and of the Orgelbewegung expressly declared. Bach began teaching compositions at Forkel, not with dry counterpoint that led nowhere, as was the way with other music teachers of his time. Still less did he detain his pupils with calculation of the tone relations, which in his opinion did not concern composers so much as pure theorists and instrument makers. He went immediately to pure 4-part thorough bass, laying much stress on the setting out of the voices, since in this way the conception of the pure progression of the harmony was made most intelligible. From there he went to the chorale. In these exercises he himself set the original bass and made his pupils add only the alto and the tenor. Gradually he let them make the bass also. Everywhere he insisted not only on the utmost purity of the harmony in itself, but also on naturalness of progression and a melodic flow of all the separate voices. He thus taught harmony and counterpoint simultaneously, and both practically. The filling in of the figured basses was to result in a genuine 4-part piece in which every voice was to be interesting. We are in a position to form a clear idea of his manner of teaching. The elements of general bass playing are described in his own hand in the Klavierbuchlein of Anna Magdalena Bach, 1725. In addition, there is a manuscript that gives in full detail the rules and principles for the four-part playing of thorough bass for his musical scholars. Thirdly, we possess a violin sonata by Albinoni with the bass realized by Gerber and revised by Bach. One is astounded at the clearness and force of Bach's method of teaching, to judge from these evidences. To avoid a succession of fifths or octaves, he says in one of the earliest lessons, it is an old rule that the hands must always go against each other, so that when the left ascends, the right descends. His pupils were not allowed to bring him compositions of their own until they had fully mastered four-part writing. Instruction in free composition began with the two-part fugue. Composition at the clavier was strictly forbidden. Bach called this kind of composer a clavier knight. Those who, when improvising, had to follow their fingers instead of their ideas, he called clavier hussars. A confused leading of the voices was forbidden. Bach permitted only obbligato, that is, strictly independent parts. He disputed the right of existence of harmonic inner parts fallen from heaven. For a slovenly leading of the voices he had the expression puddling. Every piece of music, he told his pupils, is a conversation between the separate voices that represent the characters. If one of them has nothing pertinent to say, it may keep silence for a while until it can again enter quite naturally into the conversation. But none must break in with an interjection that is meaningless and has no reason to be there. So long as they respected in this way the personalities of the voices and made the most of them, his pupils could permit themselves what liberties they liked. As regards intervals and melodic and harmonic sequences, he let them do whatever they would or could, so long as it had some meaning and served to express an idea. Every modulation had to grow out of the preceding idea. Sudden audacities that were only meant to surprise the hearer were inadmissible. So long as they were with him, his pupils were to learn, in addition to his own compositions, nothing but classical works. Bach knew only one way to get on in music, the way he himself had followed, to go to school to every true master and to learn from his works. In spite of this excellent instruction, not one of his pupils became a great composer, not even Friedemann or Emmanuel. It is difficult to form a just opinion upon the creative works of Bach's sons. There is a danger now of underrating, now of overrating them. Emmanuel's great significance in the development of the pianoforte sonata is evident from the fact that Haydn, by his own confession, was impelled along a quite new path by the study of his works. Many of Emmanuel's sonatas have even today lost nothing of their moving beauty. But at the same time there is so much in his works that is utterly insignificant that we can finally rank him only among the interesting talents. Friedemann had more genius. Many things in his vocal works remind us of his father's style. His creative faculty, however, withered all too soon. His father shewed what he thought of his clever organ concerto in D minor by doing it the honor to copy it in his own hand. This interesting autograph is in the Berlin Library. This, however, is practically all that Bach's sons achieved in organ composition. Emmanuel's 7 organ sonatas, only one of which has an obbligato pedal part, are really a negation of the organ art of Johann Sebastian. As executive artists, they were unique in their epoch. Dr. Burney, who visited Emmanuel during his continental tour of 1772, tells us in his letters that he was greatly impressed by his piano playing. When improvising, he sat before the instrument motionless, as if absent-minded, and with a look of ecstasy on his face. Friedemann was still able to astonish and transport his hearers when at the age of 64, and greatly weakened by an unsteady life and by drink, he gave an organ recital in Berlin. They did not think very highly of each other's creative work. Friedemann used to say of Emmanuel that he had done some pretty little things. Emmanuel did not express a particularly favorable opinion of Haydn. The most important organ composer from Bach's school was Johann Ludwig Krebs, of whom the facetious dilettanti of the time said that in a brook Bach there was only one crab, Krebs caught. His organ chorales are worthy imitations of those of Bach. The most important productions that have come down to us from the school of Bach are really 2 works of instruction in which we have a reflection of his genius. Philipp Emanuel's Versuch über die wahre Art das Klavier zu spielen and Kernberger's Die Kunst des reinen Satzes in der Musik. But what is the last result? Does it matter to a genius what his direct pupils do? He really becomes an instructor in the true sense of the word when his mouth has long been closed and his works begin to speak. When Bach referred to his pupils again and again to the works of the masters, as containing the sole instruction that was of any use, he could not foresee that only to a later epoch would he himself be revealed as one of the true teachers. It is said that Brahms awaited with impatience each new volume of the Bach Gesellschaft. When once he had it in his hand, he put aside everything in order to read through it. For, he said, in old Bach there is always something astonishing, and, what is the main thing, there is always something to be learned from him. When a new volume of the Handel edition came, he placed it on the shelf and said, "It is certainly interesting. As soon as I have time, I will look through it." End of chapter 11.
Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Music performed from the source text available in the public domain by Jonathan Schofield, Birmingham, Alabama.